The Road Through the Abyss by MrGreeneJeans. I live in a very rural, hilly area, which has seemingly endless miles of back roads that you can use to travel just about anywhere. In fact, there's a fairly high crime rate here simply because criminals use these roads to sneak around any police presence. It's a practice that's almost impossible to stop, given the labyrinth of trails that's almost impossible to patrol. The further you travel off the beaten path, so to speak, the fewer signs of civilization you will encounter. Still, most of the locals are very familiar with each other from their time spent out in town, doing their shopping and other errands. None of us are intimidated by the prospect of exploring some path that we'd never gone down before, as years of experience have given us a pretty good sense of direction that can save us even if we get lost. There is one exception to that rule, however. About 10 miles from my house, there is an unnamed road that leads into a heavily wooded area. Why this road doesn't have a name, I'm not sure. But it is an unspoken rule among the locals that no one, and I mean no one, is to drive down it, ever. When I was a teenager, first learning to drive, my parents warned me sternly about going into parts that were less traveled. I knew, of course, what they were referring to. That's because, for as long as I could remember, they refused to even go close to that place. I listened to them, despite my rebellious phase, which coincided with my receiving my driver's license. And for years, I actually gave the stories very little thought. That was until I turned 25 and had a house not too far from where I had grown up. One late afternoon after dinner, I was pretty bored and I was looking for something exciting to do. That's when the idea of exploring that forbidden trail came into my mind. Youthful energy meant that I didn't hesitate. I jumped into my car, I checked how much gas I had, half a tank, which should have been more than enough, and I backed out of my driveway. For some reason, perhaps due to my college education, which taught me to use reason over superstition, I felt no fear when the stories of my childhood came back into my mind. It took me about 30 minutes of driving to reach the area where I had been told the nameless road existed. The last 10 minutes of the drive, I actually saw no houses or any other signs of civilization as far as I could tell. I took 2 wrong turns before I came to a pothole-covered, paved road that branched off slightly to my left. The forest around the entrance was quite thick, and it cast a shadow down the path for as far as I could see. A thin, rusty chain hung limp across the path, which wasn't even fastened in place. I got out of my car and I pulled it aside. Just as I was about to open my door and climb back in, I stopped in my tracks. The forest around me was silent, but that wasn't what gave me pause. Looking down the road in front of me, I thought I heard something. At first, it was difficult to make out what it was, but as the sound made its way up the path and closer to me, I realized that it was a gasp. A gasp, as if nature itself were reacting in horror to something unseen. It seemed not to come from one place, but from the trees far down the road. I stood listening for a moment, wondering what on earth that could have been. Finally, I just shrugged it off as the wind doing weird things, and I got back into my car, and I started forward. By this time, it was 6:00 p.m., which meant it wouldn't get dark until around 9. So there should have been plenty of light to see where I was going. But the further I drove down the path, the darker the shadows became, and the trees became ever denser. 5 minutes went by, and then 10. I finally had to turn on my headlights because of the dense blackness that surrounded my car. A few more minutes and the sky, from what I could see of it, was utterly dark. The only source of light was coming from the front of my car. All of this was incredibly odd, but I, of course, chalked it up to a thunderstorm rolling in. What I encountered next finally made me realize that perhaps I should call off my drive. The headlights illuminated the trees on both sides of the road, but gradually, something began to change. The trees looked different. At first, it had been as if the bark around their trunks had been stripped bare, but eventually, they began to take on a sickly purple hue. Leaves became scarcer, Trunks became thinner. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen or heard of. Quite unnerved, I decided to look for a place to turn my car around. After a few more minutes, I found a small clearing off to the right side of the road, just big enough to fit my car. I slowly pulled off the road and was in the middle of a U-turn when suddenly there was a thud and scraping sound, which made my car jerk to the side. I stepped out into the darkness, using my phone's light to see. Checking underneath the car, I found that it had bottomed out on a large stump, which was keeping the front passenger wheel from touching the ground. The exhaust pipe was also torn loose, dragging the ground. I cursed under my breath, and I moved around to the back to try to push the car off. No luck. It wouldn't budge. I checked my phone to see that, of course, there was no signal. Figuring I had no choice but to abandon my car, I looked back down the road the way I had come, and then I looked down the path on in front of me. It would take me several hours to walk back that way to civilization, or I could chance it and continue onwards, hoping to find a house, or maybe the road would connect to a highway in a couple of miles. I decided to take a risk and keep going on foot. I stuck to the side of the road, using my light as little as possible while my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The only sounds were the creaks of the tree branches shifting in the wind. I did not see or hear any signs of people or animals. I made it a mile without incident. But when I passed around a bend in the road, I saw something which could be described as the beginning of this nightmare. I noticed movement about 100 feet in front of me. I stopped and tried to be as quiet as I could as I figured out what exactly it was. In the darkness, a figure was shuffling across the road. It appeared to be hunched over, deformed. I really don't know how to describe it. It was dragging something behind it. It made the sound you would think flesh being dragged across the pavement would make. I had to stifle a gasp of horror, but quickly crouched down and moved behind a tree as quietly as possible. I peeked around to watch the figure cross the road and drag whatever it was into the trees, down the hill, disappearing out of sight. What on earth is going on here? I thought to myself. I crept forward and peered over the hill where the thing had gone. All I could see was darkness, but I heard shuffling moving further into the woods, about 30 yards away. That was enough for me. It was much too late to head back, so I hurried down the road, jogging on my tiptoes to make as little noise as possible. I was looking frantically for a house, anything, any sign of help that could get me out of this place. The road became rougher, with cracks and potholes, indicating that it hadn't been maintained in a very, very long time. The darkness grew deeper, to the point where I was forced to turn my flashlight to its highest setting just to be able to see in front of me. The wind began to pick up, which began to make the trees sway and creak all around me. Above these sounds, I began to hear something coming from the sloped forest, running up to my right. It was eerie, hushed moaning, something like the undead would make. It seemed like a great host of things were wandering through the woods, given how many distinct guttural voices I heard. The creeping horror turned my blood to ice. In terror, I shielded my light in my palm to keep it as hidden as possible from whatever was lurking out there in the darkness. To my great relief, it seemed these things weren't coming any closer to the road. I managed to force my terror-stricken body forward another 100 feet. It was becoming difficult to breathe, so I had to devote much of the self-control that remained to it. I reached the point where I seemed to be directly downhill from the moans. That's when I heard the gasp. Only 15 feet away, I heard something take a sudden, deep breath, as if it were struggling for air. I instinctively whirled around towards the noise and shined my light. That was a very, very big mistake. There was a human body lying on the ground, partially covered in dirt and twigs. It was in a state of decomposition. The skin was a dark green hue, and rotting flesh was missing in places. Even lying there, I could see the chest was moving up and down. My body completely froze in horror, and all I could do was stare. After another wheeze, which exhaled a few bits of dirt, the thing must have noticed the light shining on it. It moved its dead eyes to gaze at me, then slowly turned over and tried to push itself upright. I ran. I ran down the road and lost all sense of reason in the process. All I could think about was getting away. I heard the thing stumble out of the trees and start dragging itself towards me. I'm not sure how much further I made it before I collapsed from exhaustion. I curled up in a scraggly bush a few feet into the trees and tried to catch my breath. I couldn't hear anything besides my own breathing and my heart throbbing in my ears. I lay there for what must have been 30 minutes. I'll be honest, at this point I was certain that the end was at hand for me. Still, the one thing that I refused to do was accept my fate. So I clambered out of the brush and back onto the road, and braced myself for what would probably be my last push forward. I was determined to see what was at the end of the road before I died. The darkness had become so thick that it seemed to physically restrain me. I had to throw my arms up in front of me and pull myself forward in order to move at a normal pace. It seemed to be almost water-like. I'm not sure how to describe it exactly. It made my light, even at its brightest setting, seem very dim. I struggled forward, my body completely exhausted. The darkness around me seemed hungry, as if it was a predator stalking its prey. I knew that I had to keep going or something unspeakable would happen to me, but my body was near its breaking point. If some other horror emerged from the blackness, I would not have the strength to flee or to fight. Just as my muscles began to shut down, I found my salvation. My light revealed an old gray sedan parked to the side of the road, facing away from me. The paint was faded and chipped, and a thin layer of twigs and dirt covered it. Using the last of my adrenaline, I rushed around to the driver's side and tried the handle. It was unlocked. I flung the door open, but fell backwards when I discovered, sitting in the front seat, 2 decomposed bodies slumped into the steering wheel and dashboard. All that remained were bones, bits of leathery, rotted flesh holding them together, and rotted clothing. I climbed to my feet, and without hesitation, I flung the remains of the driver out the car and I jumped in. To my great relief, the keys were still in the ignition, and after a couple of attempts, I managed to turn the engine over and get it started. I gained new life in that moment and hurriedly fumbled to turn on the headlights and shift into gear. That excitement, however, was short-lived, as it was then that I encountered the greatest horror of my nightmare. From the blackness surrounding the headlights on my car, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, with pale skin and shriveled flesh. Its eyes were dark pits. As it moved towards the front of the car, it began to open its mouth. The lips curled up to right below its eyes and to the tip of its chin, forming the most inhuman expression I could imagine. It shrieked a terrifying wail and lunged forward, its scrawny legs barely able to support its weight as it ran. I snapped out of my trance and slammed the gas pedal to the floor, cutting the steering wheel sharply. The back wheels lost traction as I spun the car around, got it stabilized, and screeched away. My focus was completely on the road as I tore out of that place. I hardly noticed anything going on outside the car, save a couple of moments where I saw dark, indiscernible figures lurking in the trees. It took me 10 minutes to pass where my car was stuck. I wasn't going to stop or come back for it. 20 minutes more and I came to the first tree that actually had bark and leaves on it. I could see the pale glimmer of what remained of the sunset beyond the hills. When I reached the entrance to the nameless road, The chain had been placed back across it. I plowed straight through, which snapped the chain and crushed the front panel of the car. But I couldn't have cared less. When I finally got home, I rushed inside, threw some essentials into a bag, and drove my other car to my friend's home, 2 hours away, leaving my escape vehicle and the skeletal remains of the passenger behind. I have no plans to go back home. I'll let the bank foreclose on my property. I don't care. After a couple of weeks of crashing on my buddy's couch, I'm flying out to the other side of the country to look for work and try to forget everything that happened. I'm going to start a brand new life, with brand new memories. I have to, for my sanity's sake. I'm writing this down as a warning to anyone who is thinking of exploring rural areas. My advice is pretty simple. Don't do it. Go to the beach or a tourist trap, someplace that has people and civilization. The deeper, more mysterious parts of the world may be intriguing, but they are also the perfect place for evil to rest its head.